They blocked an old man's access to his own cabin, and somehow thought he'd just go away. That was their first mistake. See, my grandpa Ernest wasn't the type to yell or sue. No, he had something far more inconvenient in mind. Let's just say a certain fishing club woke up to the sound of construction, right in their exclusive lakefront. This isn't your usual HOA drama. This one comes with blueprints, binoculars, and a whole lot of petty satisfaction. If you've ever dealt with smug board members who think they run the world, you're going to love how this unfolds. Hit the comments and tell me, what's your worst HOA horror story? I bet Grandpa could top it. It was a Saturday morning in September when my grandpa Ernest drove his Chevy pickup down the familiar road to Lake Serenity. For 15 years, this had been a sacred ritual. Weekends at the small lakeside cabin that he and my grandma Eleanor had turned into their private paradise. Ever since Eleanor died from cancer 2 years earlier, these trips were the only way my grandpa felt close to his wife. The cabin held every memory they'd built together, from their first anniversary celebration to quiet Sunday mornings fishing off their tiny dock. My grandpa had always been a simple man who worked with his hands, fixing water pipes for the city during the week and retreating to their sanctuary on weekends. The drive usually took 30 minutes through winding country roads, past farmhouses and old oak trees that Eleanor used to photograph every season. But today would be different. Today would change everything. He used to say that cabin was the only place he still felt her presence. At the familiar turn onto Lakeshore Drive, my grandpa felt his heart drop into his stomach. Where there had always been an open road stood a brand new steel gate with an electronic keypad and a sign that read, "Park Residents Community, Residents Only, Trespassers will be prosecuted." A young security guard in a crisp uniform approached his window with polite but firm determination. "Sorry, sir, this is a new HOA regulation effective this month," the guard explained, not making eye contact. My grandpa stared at the gate in disbelief. This road had been his pathway home for 15 years. He'd driven down this exact route every weekend since he and Eleanor bought their cabin with their savings from years of careful budgeting. The guard looked uncomfortable, but didn't budge. "I'll need you to turn around, sir, no exceptions." I remember him telling me how surreal that moment felt, facing a gate where a memory used to live. The sound of a car horn honking behind him caught the attention of Lori Haywood, who emerged from a gleaming white Mercedes wearing designer athletic wear and oversized sunglasses. With a condescending tone that made my grandpa's jaw clench, she approached his truck. "Mr. Wallace, right? We understand you have some old cabin back there, but allowing uncontrolled traffic through our premium residential community is simply unacceptable." Her voice carried the authority of someone who'd never been told no, the kind of person who believed money and position gave her the right to control everyone around her. My grandpa had dealt with plenty of difficult customers in his pipe repair work, but there was something particularly grating about Lori's assumption that she could simply erase 15 years of his legal access with a wave of her manicured hand. My grandpa took a deep breath and reached for his glove compartment, pulling out the deed and easement documents he'd kept there since 2009. With the patience he'd learned from years of explaining water pressure problems to frustrated homeowners, he spread the papers on his dashboard. "Ma'am, I've been using this road since before your community existed. My easement is recorded with the county," he said, his voice steady but with an edge that people who knew him would recognize as a warning sign. Lori barely glanced at the papers, waving them away like they were junk mail. "Sir, property rights don't include the right to trespass on our private roads. You're welcome to access your property by boat if you choose." The dismissive way she said "your property" made it clear she considered his 15-year-old cabin an eyesore that didn't belong in her vision of lakefront perfection. When my grandpa asked about the easement rights he'd used for 15 years, Lori's smile turned as cold as winter ice. "Those rights can be revoked when they affect community safety and property values. We've voted on enhanced security measures." Her tone suggested that his concerns were as irrelevant as his truck was unwelcome in her pristine neighborhood. My grandpa felt the familiar frustration he'd experienced when dealing with city bureaucrats who thought working-class people didn't deserve respect. But this was different. This was his home, his connection to Eleanor, his sanctuary being threatened by someone who saw him as nothing more than an inconvenience. The weight of loss and injustice settled in his chest like a physical pain. But my grandpa had learned long ago that showing weakness only encouraged bullies to push harder. Watching my grandpa slowly reverse his truck, his headlights reflecting off the new gate steel bars, created a powerful image of a working man being shut out from his own property. In his rearview mirror, he could see Lori speaking animatedly with several other HOA residents, pointing in his direction and laughing about something that made his ears burn with anger. The drive away from that gate felt like a retreat from everything he'd worked for, everything he and Eleanor had built together. But my grandpa Ernest had spent 23 years fixing problems that seemed impossible at first glance, and he'd learned that the most stubborn blockages usually had solutions that nobody else had bothered to look for. As he drove the long way around the lake to access his cabin by boat, he began to form a plan that would teach Lori Haywood exactly what happened when you underestimated a man with nothing left to lose. To reach his cabin, my grandpa had to drive an extra 45 minutes through country roads to get to the boat launch on the far side of the lake. His aluminum boat ran smoothly across the water, but his heart felt heavy with frustration. For 15 years, he'd never had to enter his cabin this way. The boat ride gave him time to think about Eleanor, about the life they'd built at the cabin, and about how Lori Haywood thought she could simply erase his access with a gate and a security guard. As he tied up at his small dock, my grandpa noticed unusual activity at the HOA's private beach area across the cove. Tiki torches, laughter, music, and the sounds of an exclusive party that he'd never been invited to join. He didn't know it yet, but what he was observing was the Sunrise Fishing Club, the private fishing club for HOA members, where they gathered every morning to fish at the lake's most beautiful spot. That evening, sitting on his cabin's deck looking out over the water, my grandpa used his old binoculars to get a better look at the HOA's activities. Through the lenses, he spotted a small sign at the HOA beach: Sunrise Fishing Club, AOA members only. Suddenly everything clicked into place like a pipe fitting finding its perfect connection. This wasn't just about road access. Lori wanted exclusive control over the entire lake area, turning it into a private playground for wealthy residents, while pushing out anyone who didn't fit her vision of lakefront perfection. And that meant this fight was far from over. My grandpa lowered his binoculars and looked at Eleanor's photo on the small table beside his chair. He told me later that he looked at Grandma's photo and whispered, "Well, honey, looks like your husband is about to get into the biggest fight of his life." Sunday morning brought Doug Callahan rowing his small fishing boat over to my grandpa's cabin with troubling news that would change everything. Doug was a 45-year-old carpenter who'd lost his wife around the same time my grandpa lost Eleanor, and the two men had bonded over their shared grief and love for the peaceful lake. "Ernest, I went to that HOA mixer last night, and you need to know what Lori's really planning," Doug said as he tied his boat to my grandpa's dock. His weathered hands showed the calluses of a man who'd spent decades working with wood, and his concerned expression told my grandpa that whatever he'd learned wasn't good news. "She's not just stopping at blocking your road access, Ernest. Lori has bigger plans. She wants to eliminate what she calls legacy eyesores around the entire lake. The plan was systematic and cruel. Use HOA regulations to force longtime lakefront residents to sell their properties at low prices, then have her developer contacts purchase them to create a cohesive luxury lakefront community. It was gentrification disguised as community improvement, pushing out working-class families who'd been part of the lake's character for decades in favor of wealthy newcomers who could afford million-dollar lake houses. He loved digging through old documents. Something about solving puzzles gave him peace after Grandma passed. My grandpa pored over the lake's original maps and deeds that afternoon, finding an overlooked clause that gave him legal grounds to build. Buried in the 1963 lake development documents, he discovered something that made him smile for the first time in days. Lakefront property owners retain perpetual rights to construct reasonable recreational facilities extending into public waters for private use. When Doug reviewed the documents, his carpenter's experience immediately grasped the implications. "Ernest, this means you can build a dock, hell, you can build a pier, extending out into the lake, and if it happens to block access to their precious fishing spot." Both men exchanged a meaningful look that spoke volumes about the plan forming in my grandpa's mind. He could almost hear Eleanor's voice teasing, "See, I told you reading the fine print would save your butt one day." That line from their first house purchase came rushing back as he circled the clause in red pen. This wasn't just paperwork. It was proof that his rights hadn't vanished. For the first time since the gate went up, he felt like he was standing on solid ground again. As if to prove Doug's intelligence was correct, Lori escalated her campaign with the kind of overreach that would ultimately become her downfall. An official HOA letter arrived at my grandpa's cabin within days. Notice of violation unauthorized watercraft activity. Use of motorized boats within 200 feet of residential shoreline constitutes wake damage to private docks. The new regulation effectively prevented my grandpa from accessing his cabin by boat during most daylight hours, meaning he was almost completely cut off from his property. Worse yet, the rule applied to other longtime residents who had relied on water access for decades, creating a pattern of systematic exclusion. That evening, my grandpa sat on his dock watching the lights across the lake. He once told me that moment felt like losing Eleanor all over again, watching his connection to her memory being severed by someone who saw him as disposable. He told me later that he whispered to Grandma's photo that night, "You always said I was too nice." The determination in his voice surprised him. My grandpa had always been a peaceful man who preferred fixing problems to fighting battles. But Lori Haywood had made this personal when she attacked his connection to Eleanor's memory and his right to exist in the community they'd chosen together. My grandpa began detailed reconnaissance of the HOA's lakefront facilities, using binoculars from his cabin's loft window to document their daily activities. The Sunrise Fishing Club met every morning at 6:30 with a dozen HOA members gathering at the prime fishing spot, where the lake's deepest channel came closest to shore. They used expensive equipment and treated the area like their private country club while actively working to exclude neighbors who'd been fishing these waters for decades. My grandpa researched county regulations on water construction permits, discovering that his government experience had given him advantages that Lori probably didn't realize he possessed. He knew exactly which departments handled which approvals and how to navigate bureaucracy that intimidated most people. My grandpa began sketching preliminary pier designs with the precision that had made him the city's most reliable repair technician, because this plan would only work if it was absolutely perfect from a legal standpoint. Doug's evening check-in revealed that Lori's husband Peter had mentioned environmental impact studies at a dinner party, suggesting they were planning to challenge my grandpa's water rights too. As the clock struck midnight, my grandpa made the decision that would change everything. Tomorrow morning, he would drive to the county offices and file a formal application for a recreational waterfront improvement permit. If Lori wanted to play hardball with regulations, he would show her what happened when regulations were used by someone who actually understood how they worked. Doug's final radio transmission of the evening was unknowingly prophetic. "Sleep well, buddy. Tomorrow's going to be an interesting day." My grandpa smiled as he looked out over the moonlit lake, knowing that by this time next month, the view from the HOA's fishing club would be very different indeed. Monday morning at 8 sharp, my grandpa arrived at the county planning department with military precision. He carried the same leather briefcase Grandma gave him for retirement and wore his best pressed khakis and collared shirt. His presentation was so thorough and professional that the clerk's attitude shifted dramatically within minutes. "Sir, this is the most comprehensive application we've seen this year. Processing should be straightforward," she said, clearly impressed by my grandpa's professional folder of surveys, drawings, and permits for the Eleanor Memorial Fishing Pier, a 200-foot structure extending directly into the lake's deepest fishing channel. That's the kind of man my grandpa was: thorough, quiet, and always prepared. The pier's planned location was strategically positioned exactly where HOA members gathered every morning for their exclusive Sunrise Fishing Club activities. My grandpa's engineering background was evident in every aspect of the design. The structure was positioned to maximize legitimate recreational value while creating maximum inconvenience for the HOA's exclusive access to the lake's prime fishing waters. The plans showed a robust construction that would serve families for generations, with safety features and environmental protections that exceeded county requirements. My grandpa had learned from years of municipal work that the best way to win bureaucratic battles was to be more prepared than anyone expected. That afternoon, Doug arrived at the cabin with surveying equipment and a list of contractor contacts who'd been following the situation with growing interest. "Ernest, my old crew is excited about this project. Word's getting around about what Lori did to you, and nobody likes a bully who picks on working people," Doug said as they began measuring exact distances and water depths. Doug's reputation in the local construction community meant that my grandpa would have access to skilled craftsmen who understood the deeper meaning of this project. They weren't just building a pier, they were making a statement about property rights and community values. The county planning office called Lori as a courtesy. "Miss Haywood, we have a major construction permit application for your lake area." Lori's confident expression vanished as the details were explained, and she realized that the harmless old man she'd dismissed had just made a chess move she hadn't anticipated. Her real estate background told her immediately that a 200-foot pier in the prime fishing area would fundamentally change the dynamics of lakefront access in ways she couldn't control. Lori called an emergency board meeting to discuss what she dramatically termed an unprecedented threat to community waterfront access. Her husband Peter raised cautious questions. "Honey, if his permits are legitimate, our legal options might be limited." Lori's sharp response shut down any further discussion. "Peter, let me handle community affairs. This is exactly why we need strong leadership to protect our investments." Her confidence in her ability to manipulate the system showed how little she understood about my grandpa's methodical approach to bureaucratic challenges. Lori contacted environmental groups and launched media campaigns about a spite project threatening the lake ecosystem. Her attempts to use personal influence backfired when officials realized she was trying to interfere with a legitimate permit process. The county planning department took pride in their professionalism and didn't appreciate outside pressure from HOA presidents who thought rules didn't apply to their communities. Friday afternoon brought news that shattered Lori's assumptions about her ability to control the situation. The county called with unexpected results. "Mr. Wallace, your permits have been approved. Construction can begin Monday." All environmental concerns had been thoroughly addressed, engineering specifications exceeded code requirements, and water rights documentation was legally unassailable. My grandpa's years of working within the system had taught him exactly how to navigate bureaucracy effectively, while Lori's attempts to use personal influence had created a paper trail that would eventually work against her. When the county notified the HOA about the approved permits, Lori experienced her first moment of genuine panic since taking office. Her carefully controlled community suddenly faced a construction project that she couldn't stop through normal HOA channels, and her promises to maintain property values were about to be tested in ways she'd never anticipated. While Lori made noise publicly, my grandpa quietly coordinated with Doug's construction crew, scheduling material deliveries and establishing timelines with the methodical precision that had made him the city's most reliable repair technician. Sunday evening found my grandpa sitting on his cabin deck reviewing the construction timeline with a satisfaction he hadn't felt since Eleanor's death. Phase 1, foundation and support posts. Phase 2, decking and railings. Phase 3, completion with a memorial plaque honoring Eleanor's community volunteer work. Total timeline, 6 weeks if weather cooperated. As my grandpa turned off his cabin lights, floodlights suddenly illuminated the HOA's beach club across the cove, where an emergency meeting was in progress, with Lori's animated gestures visible through the clubhouse windows. Doug's radio crackled with a warning. "Ernest, they're planning something big for tomorrow. Be ready." Dawn would bring the first day of construction and the first day of real war. 6 in the morning Monday, Doug's crew arrived at the cabin's shoreline with professional efficiency. Equipment was positioned and survey stakes marked the exact pier location with mathematical precision. My grandpa supervised from a folding chair with his thermos of coffee, watching with satisfaction as his carefully planned project began to take physical form. The crew moved with the quiet competence of experienced professionals who understood that this wasn't just a construction job. It was a statement about property rights and community values that would be visible from every house on the lake for decades to come. He told me later it was the most satisfying Monday of his life. By 8 in the morning, the scale of my grandpa's project became clear to HOA residents as the morning mist revealed the outline of massive pier foundations emerging from the water. What had seemed like an abstract threat on permit paperwork was now concrete reality directly affecting their daily lives and exclusive access to the lake's prime fishing waters. Across the cove, HOA members gathered and pointed, visibly rattled. My grandpa didn't need to see their expressions to know exactly how seriously they were taking his project, now that steel and concrete were involved. Doug said she came in like a storm, but my grandpa just sat there, calm as ever. Lori arrived at the construction site in her white BMW at 8:30, practically vibrating with fury and disbelief that my grandpa had actually followed through on his permit application. She stormed up to my grandpa's supervisory position like a general inspecting enemy fortifications, demanding an immediate halt to what she called this outrageous monstrosity. Her designer athletic wear and expensive sunglasses looked absurdly out of place at an active construction site, emphasizing the gap between her lifestyle and the working-class reality of the men who were building something permanent and meaningful with their hands. Removing his reading glasses and setting down his permit folder, My grandpa responded with the quiet dignity that had served him well in 23 years of city work. "Ma'am, all permits are in order and construction will proceed according to the approved timeline. You're welcome to review the documentation if you have specific concerns." His calm professionalism stood in stark contrast to Lori's emotional outburst. When legal threats failed to intimidate my grandpa, Lori tried emotional manipulation. "Think of the families who've enjoyed this lake for generations. Your selfish project destroys everyone's peaceful enjoyment." My grandpa's response cut deeper than she expected. "Ma'am, I've been enjoying this lake since before your community existed. Peaceful enjoyment works both ways." Throughout the first week, HOA members employed various disruption tactics that revealed their fundamental misunderstanding of how construction law actually worked. They parked cars to block delivery trucks until the sheriff's department explained that interfering with permitted construction was illegal, stood in work zones during photography sessions until insurance liability forced them to maintain safety distances, and complained loudly about noise pollution during normal construction hours until county officials reminded them that daytime construction was protected activity. Their attempts at intimidation only strengthened the crew's resolve. I grew up hearing this story so many times, and even now I still laugh at how calmly he shut them down. Doug's team proved unflappable in the face of HOA harassment, responding to every disruption attempt with professional courtesy that highlighted the contrast between working-class competence and entitled interference. By the end of the first week, public opinion was already beginning to shift as people recognized the difference between legitimate construction activity and privileged obstruction. As the first week concluded, the pier extended 50 feet into the lake, with professional-grade foundation and framework that impressed even the critics with its obvious quality and attention to detail. The impact on the HOA's Sunrise Fishing Club became more apparent each day as the pier structure began blocking their exclusive access to the lake's prime fishing water. Club members were forced to relocate their morning fishing routines to less desirable areas, and their complaints to Lori increased daily as they realized their exclusive lakefront lifestyle was being permanently altered by a working man they'd tried to push around. Lori's desperation increased as environmental complaints and personal appeals failed to stop construction that was proceeding exactly according to approved plans and county regulations. Her husband Peter reported to colleagues that his wife was barely sleeping, making irrational phone calls to county officials demanding intervention in a legally permitted project, and obsessing over property value impacts that she'd created through her own poor decision-making. Peter's legal training told him that Lori's approach was counterproductive and potentially damaging to their own interests. As the pier reached the 100-foot mark, crossing the invisible line into the HOA's prime fishing territory, Lori realized that conventional tactics were insufficient to stop a project that had been planned more carefully than any development the lake had seen in decades. Late Thursday night, Peter caught his wife researching construction reporting and making lists of potential building code violations that might provide grounds for emergency intervention. Her next move would cross the line from civil dispute into dangerous territory, but Lori's desperation had reached the point where she was willing to risk everything to maintain her vision of lakefront control. My grandpa's security cameras were ready to capture whatever came next. Tuesday morning of week 4 brought an unexpected visitor that tested my grandpa's faith in the system he'd spent decades serving. A county building inspector arrived unannounced with clipboard and serious expression, explaining that he'd received an anonymous complaint about potential safety violations that required immediate investigation. "Mr. Wallace, we need to halt construction until a full inspection is completed," the inspector announced. My grandpa's years of working with city inspectors told him this was unusual, but someone with influence had obviously pushed this inspection through the system. The inspector revealed that the anonymous tip claimed multiple violations: inadequate foundation depth, improper steel reinforcement, and unauthorized electrical work for pier lighting systems. My grandpa's permits were suddenly under scrutiny, despite previous county approval, and the timing wasn't coincidental. Lori had obviously coordinated this inspection to halt construction just as the pier was entering the HOA's exclusive fishing territory. However, my grandpa's methodical approach to documentation meant that every aspect of construction could withstand the most rigorous inspection. My grandpa cooperated fully with the inspection process, providing all documentation while the inspector examined the site. Doug's crew confidence in their work was evident as they explained every construction decision and demonstrated how each element exceeded minimum code requirements. The inspector moved through the site with a sharp eye, but everything passed. Nothing was out of place. The inspection revealed that my grandpa's pier wasn't just compliant with regulations, it was a model of how lakefront construction should be done. He once told me he didn't flinch because he knew everything was airtight. Assuming the inspection would shut down construction permanently, Lori celebrated too early, sending a triumphant message to HOA members before results were announced. Her premature celebration revealed both her involvement in the anonymous complaint and her fundamental misunderstanding of how building inspections actually worked. Lori had assumed that any inspection would find problems she could exploit, but my grandpa's professional approach to construction meant that official scrutiny would only highlight the quality of his work. After thorough examination, the inspector delivered a verdict that shattered Lori's assumptions about her ability to manipulate the system through anonymous complaints and political pressure. Mr. Wallace, your construction exceeds all safety requirements and represents some of the finest lakefront work I've seen in this county, he announced. However, the inspector's trained eye had noticed something concerning about existing structures in the area that would change everything about the lake's political dynamics. Ma'am, he said, addressing Lori, who had arrived to witness my grandpa's supposed downfall, when were permits obtained for your community's waterfront modification? The inspector's voice sharpened, now addressing the crowd that had begun to gather. These structures, this seawall, the extended dock, the private lighting system, all completed without permit review? He flipped through photos with red annotations. This isn't a minor oversight. This is systemic non-compliance. Lori opened her mouth but said nothing. For the first time, even her own board members took a step back. Even Lori's board members were stunned. My grandpa said it was the first time she looked unsure of herself. When the inspector requested HOA construction permits for their beach club facilities, Lori's confident expression crumbled like a house built on sand. The beach club expansion, seawall reinforcement, and private dock installation had all been completed without proper permits over the past 3 years, while Lori was using permit requirements as weapons against neighbors she wanted to exclude. Her attempts to weaponize the regulatory system had exposed her own organization's flagrant violations of the same rules she'd been citing against my grandpa. The inspector's investigation revealed multiple HOA violations that dwarfed any minor issues they might have found with my grandpa's carefully planned construction. Unpermitted seawall extensions, boat dock modifications without environmental review, and electrical work done without proper permits. These violations are significant and require immediate rectification, the inspector explained, while Lori stood frozen as her world collapsed around her. Daily fines would begin accumulating until permits were obtained and structures were brought into compliance. News of the HOA's unpermitted construction spread rapidly around the lake as residents realized they'd been lectured about community standards by leadership that had ignored the same standards for their own projects. Property owners who had supported Lori's safety concerns about my grandpa's pier now discovered their own facilities were illegal and subject to expensive retrofitting requirements. The revelation that their HOA fees might increase dramatically to cover legal costs created a backlash against Lori's leadership that she was completely unprepared to handle. When a local reporter asked my grandpa for comment on the inspection results, he displayed the kind of class that had earned him respect throughout his career in public service. I hope this situation helps everyone understand the importance of following proper procedures and treating all residents fairly. We all want safe, legal construction around our beautiful lake. His gracious response stood in stark contrast to Lori's desperate attempts to blame others for problems she'd created through her own shortcuts and selective enforcement of rules. At an emergency HOA meeting called to address the permit crisis, residents demanded explanations for how their organization had racked up thousands of dollars in violations, while their president was attacking a neighbor's legally permitted construction project. Lori's claims about protecting community values rang hollow. When her leadership had exposed the community to massive fines and legal liability, board members began distancing themselves from her decisions as they realized their personal liability. With all safety concerns resolved and my grandpa's permits validated, construction resumed immediately with renewed enthusiasm from a crew that had been vindicated by official inspection. The pier extension accelerated toward completion as community support grew and HOA opposition crumbled under the weight of their own legal problems. The media narrative completed its reversal as the local newspaper ran a story titled, Local Man's Memorial Pier exposes HOA building violations, and public sympathy firmly aligned with the working man who had followed every rule while being attacked by people who had ignored the same rules for years. Peter Haywood confronted his wife privately as their legal bills mounted. "Lori, you need to stop this crusade before you lose everything we've worked for." But Lori's next desperate move would cross the line from civil disagreement to criminal behavior that would end her reign of terror permanently. At 2:17 in the morning on Thursday night, motion-activated cameras triggered as two figures approached the pier construction site carrying tools that had no legitimate purpose at a building project. Infrared footage clearly showed Lori Haywood and an accomplice carrying crowbars, a sledgehammer, and bolt cutters as they moved through the darkness toward my grandpa's nearly completed pier. Wearing dark clothing and thinking they were unobserved, they began their attack on newly installed electrical conduit while working to loosen support post bolts in a coordinated effort to create safety hazards that would force construction shutdown. Their plan revealed both desperation and complete disregard for the law, as they attempted to sabotage a legally permitted construction project rather than accept that their attempts to control the lake had failed. Doug had been sleeping in the cabin's guest room, specifically for security purposes, and he woke immediately to camera alerts on his monitoring tablet that he'd positioned beside his bed. Grabbing his flashlight and phone, he quietly moved toward the shoreline while dialing 911 to report the crime in progress. His years of construction experience had taught him that desperate people sometimes resorted to sabotage when legal methods failed, and my grandpa's security preparations were about to pay off in ways that would end Lori's harassment campaign permanently. The evidence being captured by multiple cameras would provide prosecutors with an ironclad case against the HOA president and her accomplice. Doug's powerful LED flashlight suddenly illuminated the crime in progress like a theatrical spotlight, revealing the climax of a drama that had been building for weeks. Lori froze mid-swing with a crowbar in her hands while her accomplice dropped bolt cutters with a metallic clang that echoed across the water, waking residents in nearby cabins. Well, Lake Serenity's HOA president engaging in late-night construction activities, Doug announced with grim satisfaction as he documented their positions with his phone camera. Doug showed me the footage years later. Lori frozen mid-swing like she knew the lake had turned on her. The look of panic on Lori's face as she realized she'd been caught red-handed would be preserved forever in high-definition footage that would make her the most infamous HOA president in county history. Recognizing Doug's voice, Lori dropped her tools and attempted to flee across the rocky shoreline, but waterfront terrain is treacherous in darkness even for people who aren't panicking about criminal charges. She slipped on wet rocks and splashed into shallow water while her accomplice also stumbled trying to escape across unfamiliar ground in the dark. Their amateur criminal behavior was almost comical except for the serious damage they could have caused to a structure that families would be using for generations. The sound of their panicked retreat through the water probably woke half the lake, ensuring that plenty of witnesses would see the police cars arriving to arrest the community's most prominent residents. Sheriff's deputies arrived within minutes of Doug's call, finding tools scattered around the construction site, clear evidence of tampering with electrical systems, and two soaked suspects who couldn't explain their presence at someone else's property at 2:30 in the morning. Security camera footage provided irrefutable documentation of premeditated sabotage, with time-stamped evidence that would make prosecution straightforward. The arresting officer read charges that would end Lori's political career and destroy her credibility: criminal mischief, destruction of property, and trespassing with intent to commit a crime. Both women were placed in handcuffs as neighbors emerged from their cabins to witness the spectacular downfall of the HOA president, who had promised to protect their community standards. Red and blue police lights reflecting off the lake's surface created a surreal scene that attracted attention from multiple shoreline properties, as word spread through the community that their HOA president was being arrested for sabotage. By 3 in the morning, dozens of residents had witnessed Lori Haywood being led away in a patrol car, her designer pajamas and expensive slippers emphasizing how far she'd fallen from her position of authority and respect. Crime scene photos showed damaged electrical work, loosened bolts, and abandoned tools labeled with Lori's initials, providing prosecutors with evidence that would make a guilty plea almost inevitable. Children peeked through cabin blinds. Someone recorded the arrest on their phone, capturing the image of Lori soaked, breathless, and handcuffed as the sheriff read her rights. One elderly resident muttered, "About damn time," while another whispered to their spouse she thought she was untouchable. The whole lake bore witness to the fall of a self-proclaimed queen. Peter Haywood arrived at the jail to process his wife's release, his professional reputation severely damaged by association with her criminal behavior that would be front-page news throughout the county. Colleagues at his law firm immediately began distancing themselves from the scandal, and his partnership prospects were effectively destroyed by his wife's late-night crime spree. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that a lawyer's wife had been arrested for criminal behavior while attacking a working man's legally permitted construction project. Peter's marriage and career were both in jeopardy because of Lori's obsession with controlling a lake community that had never asked for her interference. Local newspaper photographers captured dramatic images of Lori in handcuffs, the damaged pier construction, and evidence bags containing sabotage tools that would make her the face of HOA overreach throughout the region. The story made regional news with headlines like "HOA President Arrested for Construction Sabotage," transforming Lori from a local authority figure into a cautionary tale about what happens when petty power goes to someone's head. Her arrest became a symbol of the broader conflict between working-class property rights and entitled interference by people who thought wealth gave them the right to control their neighbors' lives. Many residents were genuinely shocked by Lori's criminal behavior, especially those who had supported her promises to maintain community standards and property values through strong leadership. Even her most loyal supporters abandoned her when faced with evidence of late-night sabotage that could have injured construction workers or families using the completed pier. The HOA board called an emergency meeting to discuss immediate leadership changes and damage control measures that might limit their legal liability for their president's criminal actions. When reporters sought comment from my grandpa about the arrest, he displayed the characteristic dignity that had earned him respect throughout his career in public service. I'm saddened that a neighborhood disagreement escalated to criminal activity, but I hope this incident helps our community refocus on what truly matters, treating all residents with respect and following the law equally. He never gloated. He told me later, "I didn't enjoy seeing her in cuffs, I enjoyed knowing it was over." His measured response stood in stark contrast to Lori's desperate attempt to destroy property that represented years of planning and months of careful construction by skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. Criminal charges created additional legal liability for the HOA's insurance coverage, while legal costs skyrocketed as the organization tried to distance itself from their president's actions. Property owners faced special assessments to cover mounting expenses that Lori's poor judgment had created, and her promises about maintaining property values were revealed as empty rhetoric that had actually damaged the community's reputation and financial stability. The arrest marked the end of her political career and the beginning of criminal proceedings that would follow her for years. With criminal interference finally ended, Doug's crew worked overtime to complete the pier ahead of schedule while community support poured in from residents who were embarrassed by their former president's behavior. Volunteers offered help and encouragement as the Eleanor Memorial Fishing Pier took its final form, and even former critics contributed to the memorial fund honoring Eleanor Wallace's volunteer work. The project that Lori had tried to stop through criminal means became a symbol of community unity and working-class determination that would serve families for generations. The completed pier extended 200 feet into the lake's deepest channel, creating an impressive structure that commanded respect even from people who had initially opposed the project. My grandpa's engineering background showed in every detail, from the solid construction and elegant design to the memorial plaque honoring Eleanor's community service that would remind future generations about the importance of treating neighbors with dignity and respect. As the weekend approached, residents began organizing a dedication ceremony that would celebrate not just the pier's completion, but the community's recovery from Lori Haywood's divisive leadership. I'll never forget that morning. Over 200 community members came for a ceremony my grandpa never imagined when he filed that permit. Saturday morning brought a celebration that transformed what had begun as a property rights dispute into a testament to community values and working-class determination. The local mayor presented my grandpa with a proclamation honoring his perseverance in the face of adversity and contribution to community recreational resources, while children who had learned to fish from the pier's railings played in the background. The ceremony represented everything that Lori Haywood had tried to prevent, a diverse community coming together to celebrate a project that would serve families regardless of their income level or social status for decades to come. The pier had immediately become the centerpiece of lake activity, with children learning to fish from grandparents, families picnicking on the spacious decking, and couples enjoying sunset walks along the 200-foot extension into pristine waters. My grandpa's engineering background was evident in every detail, from the accessibility features that welcomed disabled visitors to the environmental protections that actually improve fish habitat through artificial reef structures below the waterline. The most emotional moment came with the unveiling of Eleanor's memorial plaque, a bronze inscription that read, "Eleanor Wallace, 1949 to 2022, beloved wife, community volunteer, friend to all, building bridges between hearts." My grandpa's voice broke slightly as he read the dedication, remembering his wife's fierce protection of their home and her belief that communities were strongest when they welcomed everyone rather than excluding people who didn't fit narrow definitions of acceptability. That plaque means more to our family than any trophy ever could. Peter Haywood approached my grandpa during the ceremony with genuine humility that stood in stark contrast to his wife's entitled behavior throughout the conflict. "Mr. Wallace, I owe you a tremendous apology for my wife's inexcusable actions. This pier brings honor to Eleanor's memory and joy to our entire community," he said, shaking my grandpa's hand with the respect that Lori had never shown. Peter's legal training had taught him to recognize when he was on the wrong side of both law and morality, and his public apology helped begin the healing process that the community needed after months of divisive conflict. Lori ultimately pled guilty to reduced charges, receiving probation, community service, and restitution payments that would remind her for years about the cost of her attempt to control neighbors through criminal behavior. Peter proceeded with divorce proceedings and relocated his practice to another county, hoping to rebuild a legal career that had been damaged by association with his wife's increasingly erratic behavior and criminal actions. The new HOA leadership implemented transparent governance policies that prevented future abuse of power while establishing cooperative relationships with all lakefront residents, regardless of their property values or social status. The organization became a model of responsible residential management that other lake communities began studying and emulating. The changes represented everything that Lori's authoritarian approach had failed to achieve: genuine community improvement through inclusive leadership. 6 months after the pier's completion, lakefront property values had increased 15%, making it the highest appreciation rate in the county, and vindicating my grandpa's belief that quality recreational amenities benefited everyone in the community. The pier attraction drew families from surrounding areas, creating positive economic impact for local businesses while demonstrating that Lori's fears about declining property values had been completely unfounded. Fishing tournaments attracted regional participants, and photographers captured stunning sunrise and sunset shots that appeared in tourism publications throughout the state. Doug and my grandpa's friendship had deepened through their shared experience of standing up to bullying and bureaucratic manipulation, and they began co-hosting weekly coffee on the pier sessions that became informal community mediation opportunities for future disputes. Local high school civics classes began using the pier incident as a case study about property rights, community governance, and peaceful conflict resolution, with students interviewing my grandpa about civic engagement and the importance of standing up for principles even when the odds seem overwhelming. The community contributed funds to expand the memorial gardens surrounding the pier entrance, creating walking paths, native plant displays, and benches featuring Eleanor's favorite quotes about nature and community service. The garden became a peaceful place for reflection and remembrance, where families could honor loved ones while children played safely near the water. State environmental agencies featured the pier in newsletters as an example of beneficial lake development that actually improved fish habitat while providing recreational access. 1 year after the dedication ceremony, my grandpa sat on his pier every morning with coffee and Eleanor's photo, watching the lake come alive, with families enjoying the structure they'd built together through determination and careful planning. He once told me he said to her picture as sunrise painted the water golden, "Sweetheart, your stubborn husband learned something important about standing up for what's right. Sometimes the best way to honor the people we love isn't through quiet acceptance of injustice, but through bold action that creates something beautiful for everyone to enjoy." The pier had become a permanent fixture in Lake Serenity's community identity, with real estate listings featuring access to award-winning Eleanor Memorial Pier and the community newsletter header showing the pier's silhouette against sunset skies. My grandpa became an unofficial grandfather to dozens of local children who fished from the pier while learning about patience, respect for nature, and the importance of standing up for what's right, even when powerful people try to push you around. Now, we fish from that pier every summer. My kids call it Great Grandma's Bridge, and every time we do, I remember the quiet man who stood his ground, not with anger, but with steel and patience. He didn't build revenge. He built legacy. Sometimes life blocks your path when you least expect it, he used to tell them as they cast their lines into water that reflected the golden sky. When that happens, you don't give up and you don't get angry. You find another way forward that creates something better for everyone. Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. It's creating something so beautiful, so beneficial, and so obviously right that your opponents have no choice but to admit they were wrong. My grandpa Ernest didn't just build a pier. He built a bridge between what was and what could be, proving that working-class determination and community values will always triumph over privilege and exclusion when good people stand up for what's right. The Eleanor Memorial Fishing Pier stands today as a testament to the power of ordinary people to create extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice and work together to build something better for future generations.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. Share this video with someone who loves a good plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe.